So today on Mind Matters, Corey and I are going to be discussing some more of Chapter 5 of Political Ponerology. That's the chapter on pathocracy. So specifically, we're going to talk about the sections on, well, actually, probably just the one section on pathocracy and its ideology. Like the relation of pathocracy and ideology has come up, in pretty much most of the summary talks we've given on other chapters in the book, but this is kind of just like a little distillation and a look at the ideology specifically applied to the phenomenon, like the social system of pathocracy. So Lobaczewski starts out the section by saying, it should be noted that a great ideology with mesmerizing values can also easily deprive people of the capacity for self-critical control over their behavior. The adherents of such ideas tend to lose sight of the fact that the means used, not just the end, will be decisive for the results of their activities. Whenever they reach for overly radical methods of action, still convinced that they are serving their idea, they are not aware that their goal has already changed. The principle, the end justifies the means, opens the door to a different kind of person for whom a great idea is useful for purposes of liberating themselves from the uncomfortable pressure of normal human custom. Every great ideology thus contains danger, especially for small minds. Therefore, every great social movement and its ideology can become a host upon which some pathocracy initiates its parasitic life. So that kind of right there, it summarizes like some of the talks that we've had in previous months on this subject, how every ideology, even like, well, if you look at any ideology, a lot of them are, great in some sense. They seem, or at least they seem great on the surface. They seem to have like high, noble causes that they're working towards. And we even discussed that in terms of just the overall kind of direction and aims of like socialist ideologies or more expanded, like just progressive policies, how there seems to be a well-intentioned and nicely motivated impulse behind those political actions and those movements. It just seems natural, right? Well, who doesn't want justice? Who doesn't want social justice? Who doesn't want some form of equality? It just seems like a natural thing, at least probably more natural for a certain like demographic of the population. But at least to like left-leaning individuals like myself, with just that kind of temperament, it just seems natural, right? But what ideologists, like the people who are attached to these ideologies, don't seem to realize is that isn't necessarily a good thing. Like just the fact that you have good intentions and what you perceive to be like a self-righteous outlook on life and what should be done to right the wrongs that you see in the world, to bring justice where there is injustice, just because of those motivations, that doesn't make you a good person. That doesn't make your ideology good, and that doesn't mean that things can't go like drastically downhill. And that's the main message, because the main message, I think, one of the main messages of political ponerology is that those great motivations are oftentimes they are the catalyst for the worst atrocities in human history. It's not like the worst things that happen. Like if we look at the 20th century, it's not like all the bad things that happened were the result of just like transparently evil people wishing evil things. It was for the most part good, ordinary people wanting good things who were then steered in a direction counter to their own like consciously held beliefs. Like it's not like all of the leftist, socialist, communist like revolutionaries were just out to destroy the world. That was one thing they were out to do, but they had the best motivations, and people could get behind it because they saw real injustice in the world, and they were hurting in some sense, and they saw other people hurting, and it's like, and that's that impulse to that impulse of compassion to help and to make things better is what gives the social movement the fuel to to radically right those wrongs and to gain power, to gain the power necessary to be able to do something about it. But like Lobaczewski says, when you have that goal, that end to which you are directing your actions and the actions of others in your entire social movement, then at that point, means become a very important factor. What means are you going to use? Because the more you adopt radical means, the more your goal shifts. So if you are like verbally for social justice, and the means that you use to bring about that justice are like intolerant and violent, all of a sudden you're not fighting for social justice anymore. You're fighting for something completely different. Even if you still believe you're fighting for social justice, it's not what you're going to bring about, and it's not what you're actively like in practice working towards. Your goal has changed, whether you know it or not. And like Lobaczewski said, that process opens up the space for what we might call in the West, bad actors, for people with like transparently evil motives, even if they don't state them outright. The movement then becomes a kind of Trojan horse, or a mob in which to disguise yourself as just one of the mob, as just one of a group of like-minded people, when you are a wolf in sheep's clothing, essentially. That is what characterizes radical social movements, and like people, some people see it all. Like usually, it's the conservatives that see it, because the main feature of conservatism is conserving the status quo, whatever that status quo is. So any revolutionary is going to be perceived as a threat. So naturally, the conservatives in any culture, in any society that is undergoing or that is experiencing a revolutionary movement of this sort, is going to raise the alarm, because they see that this social movement is going to change things, even if those things that they're trying to conserve are should be changed, or if there are very good reasons for wanting those present conditions to be changed. The conservatives are naturally going to want to conserve them. That's just the way conservatives work. So after making those points, Lobaczewski brings more of the like ideology into the focus. So the next major point that he makes in this section is kind of like, it seems like a matter of semantics, but he points out that it's not semantics, and that is when you look at the phenomenon that he labels pathocracy. He's pretty explicit that it's wrong to refer to that phenomenon using the name of its ideology. So, for example, if you're looking at the USSR, a socialist system, you shouldn't call it socialism. Or if you do, you should be very precise in what you're referring to as socialist. Like if you're talking about socialism as an ideology, you should be talking about the ideology of socialism. And because in the process of ponerogenesis, something happens where that ideology, whether it has flaws or positive things about it or not, that ideology morphs into something that is only a caricature of that original ideology. So you can be a critic of socialism without necessarily conflating socialism with pathocracy, because they're in the USSR or in the Eastern Bloc, or any of the countries that adopted the socialist model of the Soviet Union. Those two phenomena are like amalgamated, like they're intertwined in some way. There is some remnant of that ideology, but it has acquired all of these additional features that can only be described like using the language of Ponerology. Getting to like a way of speaking of it that is more based on like psychobiology, psychology, and essentially using the language of disease. It is more like a social disease than it is, it's better described as a social disease than it is described in terms of the ideological movement that gave birth to it.
Right, because Lobaczewski writes that differentiating the essence of the pathological phenomenon from its contemporary ideological host is a basic and necessary task. Because if we accept the name furnished by the ideology of a social movement which has succumbed to degenerative processes, we lose any ability to understand or evaluate that ideology and its original contents. So basically, the positive aspects of the ideology, the things that people originally were drawn to about that ideology, you toss the baby out with the bathwater, and that's partly, I imagine, something that pathological individuals want you to do. They want you to continue to toss out all of the good things about ideologies until you're just left with this nihilistic, really cynical approach to to how to organize your life, how to organize social life. And another thing is that you become crippled by an inability to get to the crux of the matter, which is individuals with deviant, various deviant characters who are warping this ideology and using it in ways that the whatever original adherents did not want, or you miss the entire subterranean process that's going on, and it sets you up for the entire process to complete, to just circle around again in the future, because you're not looking for what's actually happening. You're looking for Stalin. You're looking for Hitler. That's what you're looking for. You're not looking for this all of these different attributes of the Ponerization process that Lobaczewski points out, specifically like the change in language, the growth of like he was talking about radical ways of trying to meet the ends. The ends justify the means, and all these subtle twists that will point out to you that there's a pathological movement occurring, and so then treating that differently than from just something partisan. It's not just political. It's like you were saying. It's so much more than that. You have to really take a medical kind of point of view to understand what's going on and to maybe nip it in the bud rather than feeding into it. Because if you just see it as a partisan issue, then you are just as likely to fall prey to those subterranean processes that are going on. You can start to engage in the same kinds of thinking as the other side, for lack of a better term.
Right, and one of the other points that Lobaczewski makes about why you shouldn't do this is that you can't combat it otherwise. Like if you stick within the simplistic, like almost binary categories of them and us, those evil socialists and us, so historically during the Cold War, the Westerners versus the evil communists. If you leave it at that level of analysis, you're not going to be able to do anything, because you're essentially being an ideologist yourself by reducing everything to one factor, right? One explanatory principle, where the phenomenon itself is much more complex and multifaceted. So for instance, if you're a reverse Marx, so you're not a communist, but you think that everything reduces down to economics, like the Homo economicus. If you think that everyone is economically motivated and out of self-interest, and that's your view of human nature, then you might look at a socialist country and say, oh well, they just need to change their economic system and everything would be great. But that completely it won't work. Lobaczewski is basically saying, because the system isn't the problem with the system isn't primarily an economic problem. It is an economic problem, but it's way more than that. So what you'd essentially get is, okay, well let's try to institute these new capitalist, let's say, policies. Well, you'd still have a pathocracy. The social structure would still be organized according to in the way in which Lobaczewski describes it. You'd still have a pathocratic leadership and social system, and you probably even wouldn't even be able to get certain economic practices or put into effect because of the inherent corruption and pathology of the entire social system. It probably wouldn't even work. So to the extent that you would be able to actually change the economic policies, not much would even change. You'd probably even be stopped from making those changes in some systemic way, because the problem isn't economic. The problem is psychological. It's the psychological, intertwined with the social, which has created an entire social hierarchy, social system that is kind of impregnable to an economic attack, let's say, or method of regime change. It's just not going to work.
Well, that makes me think of, you were talking about how ideologies can present like systems of delusions. I think, did you touch on that already?
I just briefly
touched on it. Well, when you think about it like that, you think about how Lobaczewski writes, that famous pioneers of contemporary psychiatry correctly distinguish between the disease and the patient's systems of delusions. So a disease has its own etiological causes, its own pathodynamics, and symptomatics which distinguish its nature. But various delusional systems can become manifest within the same disease, and similar systems can appear in different diseases. So you can be a paranoid schizophrenic who believes that Satan lives under your bed, or you can believe that the USSR is tapping your phone, or that the CIA is in your Wheaties, and you could be a paranoid schizophrenic and have each of those different, symptoms or systems of delusions. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't change the underlying facts is that these individuals all have paranoid schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And so when you're looking at the history of these ponerized ideologies, these caricatures of themselves, it's like you're looking at something very similar. Yeah. You're looking at, like some macro-social paranoid schizophrenic who thinks that everyone's a fascist, or that thinks that you have to ethnically cleanse your population, or who thinks they have these systems of delusions, and you can't. And the best way, he also points out, that you cure this is not by combating their delusions. That's not the best way to do it, because if you, as a psychiatrist, if you just go in there and you just tell them, you're an idiot, you dummy, there's no CIA in your Wheaties, or the USSR isn't even around anymore. That's not going to work. He says, you might even prompt them to want to commit suicide and just, make the crisis more severe. But what you would probably do, if you were knowledgeable in this, is probably something along the lines of something like Jordan Peterson is doing, where you would focus strictly on the mental hygiene aspect, and you would focus on putting out messages that are more in line with healthy common sense, healthy self, critical attitudes, just basic kind of growing up, being responsible, that kind of a message you would want to put out there to individuals who are undergoing some kind of a hysterical period like this, because it just doesn't seem to work. You know what I'm saying? And that's what he's saying, is that you don't the systems of delusions are just themselves delusions. They're fun to make fun of, I guess. I mean, the modern times, there's just so many delusions out there, so many systems, but underneath, you're dealing with something completely different. And that's not to say that everyone is like a paranoid schizophrenic. Like all of these are like paranoid schizophrenics, because clearly some are like psychopathic predators. It's just a whole amalgamation of different sicknesses, and then you have to, I guess you would probably have to gear your approach towards what works for different sicknesses. Mm-hmm. And then that's why he says you need to have a medical type of differential diagnosis going on in order to understand what this mass of people presenting with this common delusion, where what's the primary delusion, what's their primary neuroses, where are the psychopathic type individuals, and how much of what kind of a message can you give to give the largest percentage of them some semblance of sanity back, so that the more insane, the most insane and incurably insane lose some of their hold over the group, and it maybe it disperses.
Well, I think like
a psychic chemo kind of thing.
I think that his, like, the analogy with disease that he uses kind of we'll get to more of that in a later chapter when he talks about I think like therapy for the world is one of the last chapters. because he's got some specific things to say about how to go about healing the disease. But for the purposes of this section, he's kind of just hammering home the similarities between the two phenomena. So like an individual disease process and then like a macrosocial disease. So like the point that you said, Corey, it's essentially the main point he's making is that you can have a disease that leads to different symptoms. So one disease can appear in like 3 different ways, let's say, but you can also have the same appearance, the same set of symptoms that can be produced by, let's say, 3 different diseases. So if you have paranoid schizophrenia and you're seeing the CIA in your Wheaties, well, you might not have, if you're seeing the CIA in your Wheaties, you might not have paranoid schizophrenia. You might have some kind of like drug-induced like psychosis or something. There are different pathways to get to that specific set of symptoms, that whatever you're presenting with when you come into the psychiatric office or whatever. So the connection with the social systems, he's saying, is that there are actually different pathways to the same delusional system. And so he gives the example of there are 3 pathways, according to him, to pathocracy, to a specific form of pathocracy. So let's say you take the specific model of like a Soviet pathocracy. You can get there through like a homegrown process where it, you could call it like a spontaneous, social movement that generates within a society, or you can have your country basically invaded by another country and they impose by force this new system, this new social system, which is not limited to government, or it can be artificially infected. Basically like through psychological warfare and espionage. So those are the 3 pathways that he sees as leading to the same outcome. So you've got the same delusional system, but they've gotten there through 3 different like disease pathways. And what you do will depend on which one of those is true, because they have different features. Like for example, in the Eastern Bloc countries, they were like in Poland or Czechoslovakia, like Romania, like the system was seen, even though the system was seen as like a foreign invasion, even if it wasn't literally a foreign invasion. So like Lobaczewski says, it's like for the Poles that he lived with at the time, it was like they saw it as a foreign system. So there was kind of like this it was easier to achieve unity among the general public in opposition to the system because they saw it as foreign. They saw it as Soviet. And you can see the remnants of this in some of the like ex-Soviet republics, like in Ukraine and in like the Baltics. It's like where there is this residual hatred of all things Russian. They still see the Russians as the problem, despite the fact that it's been 30 years and it's just not the most accurate nor the most healthy way of looking at either history or the present, but that's where it comes from. Is it was seen as this foreignly imposed system, which kind of united the people against the system of government. But you can also have the same symptoms that are produced by like totally different diseases. It's this different example of the same phenomenon. So, for example, like he points out, like ideologies can be deformed. Well, they are deformed in a pathocracy to become that caricaturized version that he describes. But ideologies are also deformed in like a hystericized society, in a society like characterized by like mass social hysteria. Ideologies deform in both of them. So you'll have this deformation of ideology happening in a so-called normal country, in a state of hysteria, and in a pathocratic country. But there will be slight differences between them. And just on that point, like when you're looking at specific features of a certain form of society, they can be shared by all kinds of like varied social systems, varied so-called normal or pathocratic, like you'll see censorship in both, for instance. Like there's a particular form of censorship that you see in like a totalitarian system, and then there's a particular form of censorship that you see in a hystericized society. like the way he describes it in the chapter on the hysteroidal cycle is like in a hystericized society, it's not like there's this top-down mandate, like you can't publish these sorts of things, and you've got like a censor in the office looking at your stuff and saying, no, take out this, take out this, take out this. It's a process that's more internal. Like everyone just kind of knows the rules, and so you don't need an official government censor in your office to do the work for you. You just automatically know to self-censor yourself on certain things. So that's what we see in the States, in the entire West today in regards to like the whole anti-Russian hysteria, for instance. It's like everyone just knows that that's what you do. And if there's a good story about Russia or something that debunks some kind of nonsense that they published before, it's like, you just don't talk about it. And like I doubt that there are like official government censors in any of these offices doing that. Of course, there are definitely going to be spies in various newspaper offices, shifting like massaging the narrative in certain directions for specific ends. But it's not the kind of like overbearing totalitarian thing that you saw, for instance, in the Soviet Union. The different flavors of the same kind of different flavors of censorship, you could say.
Well, so correct me if I'm wrong, though, but you pointed out the two different forms of the polarization of ideologies, and it seems to me that in terms of just a social hysteria, one of the primary purposes of this distortion of the ideology is to basically, he says it. He writes about the importance of using it to conceal from your own mind and from the public opinion the drastic state of the disease. And and when you're talking about human behavior and society, what you're doing is you're trying to prevent yourself from seeing what you've done. And in that sense, it does become a self-reinforcing cycle where, like you said, you don't want to publish something good about Russia because then that makes you look bad, that you were wrong when you were being hysterical. But from just the purely normal society standpoint, succumbing to hysteria, that you can have this drastic caricature of an ideology just because you are, there's this disease that's proceeding dynamically, and you are using that ideology to justify your actions. And so in that sense, you don't have to have someone who's psychopathic involved, because as he writes, in the well-developed, like pathological, pathocratic system, the psychopaths have a completely different attitude towards the ideology, and they couldn't give two craps less about it. I mean, they don't need it. I mean, they need it in as much as that is their mask of sanity. But they don't have any qualms about their past behaviors or anything like that. And people will pick up on their barely concealed contempt for this ideology. But for just normal people in a fit of madness, it's more like their lifeline to just to their last connection to reality before they snap.
I think that that relates to something we talked about. I think it was in our last show on Ponerology about ideologies, and how like there were, I think, like the 3 or 4 stages of the deformation of the ideology and the Ponerogenic movement, basically, and how. So I think what the phenomenon you're describing about like the normal person like attached to an ideology, that would be. They'd be in the stage of the kind of the weaponization of the ideology. So it's like that's when the ideology is used as a like motivation and justification for action. And the pathocratic one, where you talk about the pathocrats having contempt for the ideology that you're using, that's the kind of final stage. That's the dissimulative stage of pathocracy, where the ideology is used just as a mask. And as a tool for action, but of a different sort. So the action then becomes the total repression of the population, essentially, of the internal population of its own citizens. So when you have the ideology at that other stage, it's like I think at that point it's not even a conscious process. Yeah, it's like subconscious process going on in someone of that ideology. So they're blocking stuff from their own, blocking, like Lobaczewski might put it, blocking self-critical associations. So anything that might have previously irked that person's conscience, it's like that just doesn't become conscious for them. They're blinded by their ideology. But for that person, they're still attached to the ideology. They're still a true believer, in a sense. So the ideology hasn't become a caricature yet. It's just become brutalized or weaponized. So these are the true believers we're talking about. So like this goes back to the show we did on where we talked about, I think, like right sector and Salafi jihadism, about the true believers. Like as bad as the true believers are, they still haven't reached the caricature stage of the ideology. Like that comes after power has been solidified and control has been solidified in the country. Then the ideology has, by that time, it has shifted into just a complete caricature of itself, to the point where the like ex-adherents of the ideology are joking about the leaders because they're so obviously out of touch with the ideology that they're professing. There's a complete disconnect between the two. So with the actual believers, that they're still in the, like, if their movement is still in the stage where they have like true believers like that, it's because it hasn't achieved power yet. Essentially, they're still at the stage where the ideology has this kind of like motivating force for people that they can actually believe in it and use it to achieve certain ends. But it's deformed in such a way, like Lobaczewski said, that the adoption of and the utilization of like more radical techniques, more radical methods of action have shifted the goalposts a little bit. So these people can still believe that they are, moving towards goal X, but they're not anymore. They're actually moving towards like pathocracy, and they don't realize it. And then once pathocracy happens, it's like then they're the ones going to the guillotine. They're the ones, being put in concentration camps. They're the ones being. Well, I'm going to jump ahead to a paper here. Just let me get a quote from it. What was it? It was they're the ones who are being made to leave the party of their own free will. That was a joke in some of the communist countries. So
you are free to do what we tell you.
Yeah. So then at that point, it's like that's when you can call the ideology like a caricature of its original version. It's not even like a weaponized, radicalized version of itself. It's not even like it's not Antifa on the streets, calling for, bashing the heads of fascists. It's Antifa in power, bashing their own ex-members, right, because they think that their purpose is actually to battle fascists, right? It's like it inverts upon itself and becomes a total caricature. And even if the original ideology was ridiculous in the first place, like an ideology can be completely batshit crazy and still not be a caricature of itself in the sense that Lobaczewski's talking about here.
Well, see, now that's one thing that I was thinking a lot about in preparation for the show is what makes a good ideology versus a bad one? Because you're talking about goals. These ideologues, they have goals. They think they're going towards X, but they're really going towards Y. And Lobaczewski talks about how ideologies can have a truth deficit, which just mars them from the very beginning. And so I was thinking a lot about that, what makes a good ideology and what makes a bad ideology. And I was thinking about the origin of the word ideology. It was originally, back in the French Revolution, it was supposed to be a science. I can't remember the name of the guy who founded it, but ideology was basically like the zoology of ideas. And then over time, it kind of gained its own sort of meaning, and now we've ended up with a number of different definitions of it. But when I think about a lot of these ideologues and, modern ideologies, like Antifa, in as much as that has an ideology, right sector in as much as they have an ideology, and, different Salafi jihadi type groups, I think that religion is a little bit more of seems like a better word, just in my, just from what I think of when I think of their behavior, because it's a completely binding force that tells them, everything about the past, the present, and the future. And they have gods, and they will sacrifice everything for these gods. But their religions, they don't realize that they're religions. It's like from the very beginning, they think that, you believe that you can change the world. Just from the very outset, a part of it seems like every ideology is the sense that you can change the world to look the way that you want to. And so I think that just from that, just at the very core idea, that premise that if we get enough people together, if we convince enough people that we can change the world, whether it's right sector, making Ukraine great again, or, turning it into an imperial power, or Salafi jihadis thinking they, change the political structure of whatever society to force it to be what they want it to be. You've immediately embarked, like you think you're going towards X, but you're already going towards this place that that is completely contradictory to common human sense, just any sense of humility or understanding of, man's place in the universe. And so just when you were talking about that it got me to thinking about just ideologies in general, and, the meaning of the word, and some of the common just truth deficits. That seems to me to be one of the biggest truth deficits in terms of setting yourself up for failure of just the worst kind.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of what Jordan Peterson talks about in Maps of Meaning, and what he's talked about in some of the talks on that book about he thinks there's a difference between ideology and religion, in the sense that religion is more basically religion has more aspects to it than ideology. Ideology is like a retarded and just diseased version of religion. It's missing something essential that that religions have. So ideology is just like a pale, thin, weak version of religion, and that's why he thinks all the ideological movements of the past couple centuries have led nowhere, essentially, or to something horrific like in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, or China or Cambodia or wherever. That it's because of the inherent lack within that ideology. So what Lobaczewski would say to that is that even so, taking your point and saying let's classify all these ideologies as religions. Like what Lobaczewski would say would be, or we can do it the opposite way and say, let's just say all religions too are ideologies. That'll be easier for talking about Lobaczewski. So Lobaczewski would say that there are that ideologies can be corrupt and pathologized from the beginning, or they can acquire that pathology by adding stuff in at various times in their history. So he would look at the major religions as being normal and potentially positive systems for a culture, for a society, that have various degrees of pathology inherent in them, and which can acquire additional pathologies and pathological material in certain circumstances. So you can have, just like we see today, we can have overwhelmingly Christian nations or Muslim nations, or like a Jewish nation, or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, and those societies can be relatively well functioning, or can survive relatively well and function relatively well, without being necessarily pathocracies. And because they've got that kind of, Nassim Taleb would call it, that Lindy effect. They've stood the test of time, and they've learned, they've developed over time and evolved over time to to just have that lasting effect that of something that works, essentially. But within those systems, you can have various degrees of like dysfunction, and you can have like kind of like periodic episodes within the histories of those ideologies, those religions, of like extreme pathology, where something additional has accreted itself onto that system, and you see what could be like an abomination, or something out of the ordinary that's come into that history. So you can see that in like with the rise of Salafi jihadist movements, or various kind of like extremist Christian groups, or extremist Jewish groups, or extremist Hindu, or whatever groups. You can see these little movements like grow up from time to time. But on the other hand, you can have an ideology that is more pathological from its inception. So this is where you get like all the ideological theorists of like the 18th and 19th centuries coming on. So you've got people like Marx, who have created an ideology that has more pathological material built into it. So when put into practice, it's not going to have the staying effect, or the survival power that all of the major religions have, because of the degree of pathology inherent in the ideology itself. So that's why every time someone has tried to have a people's revolution, or some country or some social movement has tried to effect a people's revolution along the Marxist model, it has never gone quite according to plan, because it can't go according to plan. That actually gets into something that Lobaczewski gets into on, again, looking at the ideology as like equivalent or analogous in some way to like a delusional system. Basically, like an ideology, just like a system of delusions, they start like in their like taking ideology back to the ideas, the concept of ideas, or just ideas themselves. They start as what he calls the conviction the conviction outlining methods of action. So basically, you start with your ideas that give you the motivating force for your actions. So this is just a belief structure, a belief system, and that's what it starts out as, and that's what any ideology will start out from, and that's what religions do in a better way, is that they provide like the entire system for how to live your life, essentially, how to live your life individually and in a group, and they're effective in what they do to greater or lesser degrees. It's not to say they're perfect, but they've worked, and then. But what happens as this, as the disease progresses, as it becomes a delusional system, as opposed to just like what merely starts out as maybe like a false belief, is that in the context of pathocracy, and in the context of like, let's say, paranoid schizophrenia or something like that, or not necessarily paranoid schizophrenia, but just certain types of mental illness, just to leave it general, is that Lobaczewski basically says it morphs into a disguising story. So it's covering up something else. And the way he describes that in terms of mental illness is like a patient who is concealing their illness, through their delusional system. I don't know exactly how that works, because he doesn't really go into detail, so I'd have to think about that.
I know. Well, I was thinking about that as well, and it was hard to picture it. The only thing that I could think of was somebody who had some sort of an addiction of some kind, and they're using every possible kind of pity ploy, to get you to not confront them about it, to enable them.
Well, it's actually, it's pretty simple, because like the delusion is the lie, essentially. It's the excuse that they're giving for something that they either can't or won't admit to themselves. So when you have a delusional system, like, it's not that the CIA's in your Wheaties. It's like that is that's disguising some other thing. Well, it's disguising the fact that you have paranoid schizophrenia, or or it's some kind of drug-induced psychosis or whatever. It's disguising the actual disease and replacing it with the delusional system, which is like this, which you are using either to deceive the people around you, or to deceive yourself, because you can't admit to yourself that there's something wrong with you, essentially, that you need help, or both. And there are examples that he gives, as a clinician in the book, in other places where he describes, encountering people like that who are not only trying to convince themselves that there's there's nothing wrong with them, but they're trying to convince him, their therapist, that there's nothing wrong with them. That's the example he uses for the dissimulative phase of the pathocracy. It's like it's the not necessarily the mask of sanity, a type of mask of sanity that someone with mental illness will use to try to convince everyone that's, oh no, everything's okay, nothing wrong with me. Maybe, I think probably at root because a lot of these people don't want to admit it to themselves, whereas with a different kind of thing going on, like with personality disorders, I'd say in those cases it's more of just trying to convince other people. Like with psychopaths are perfectly aware of their own nature, but they're primarily trying to deceive other people so that other people don't realize what they're like and what their motivations and what their desires are. So there's this. So what he says about that, like the reason that an ideology becomes a disguising story, like this dissimulative tool that pathocrats use, is because, like he points out, the ideology itself is quickly exposed as unworkable. And the example, of course, that he's primarily basing this off of is socialism, as envisioned in the Marxism, Leninism, the primary ideology of the communist socialist countries. It just didn't work. It turns out you can't actually structure an economy or a social system that way. It won't work for various reasons. And so after that, the second thing that he points out is that, Corey, you mentioned this earlier, is that pathocrats have a naturally contemptuous attitude towards the ideology itself. It's like they don't actually have any skin in the game. They're not actually socialists, for instance. They could care less about socialism or Marxism or any specific ideology. They're just there for power and for their position. That's where the postmodernist interpretation might be right, is that there is a group of people that is just out for power. It's just most people aren't like that. Pathocrats aren't like that. They just want other people to work for them, essentially, and they want to be the ones in charge. So, one or two quotes, and then I think we might wrap up for today. First, this is, I'll just read this paragraph. So, understanding the nature of a disease is basic to any search for the proper methods of treatment. The same applies by analogy with regard to that macrosocial phenomenon, pathological phenomenon, especially since, in the latter case, mere understanding of the nature of the disease starts curing human minds and souls. So this gets back to, when we were mentioning like therapy for the world and the actual process of kind of curing the disease. The advantage or one of the positives of like this kind of pathocratic system is that just knowing about it, just knowing what's going on, is a huge step in making things right, in turning things around. So then he goes on. Psychopaths are conscious of being different from normal people, like I just mentioned previously. This is why the political system, inspired by their nature, is able to conceal this awareness of being different. They wear a personal mask of sanity and know how to create a macrosocial mask of the same dissimulating nature. When we observe the role of ideology in this macrosocial phenomenon, quite conscious of the existence of this specific awareness of the psychopath, we can then understand why ideology is relegated to a tool-like role, something useful in dealing with those other naive people and nations. Pathocrats must nevertheless appreciate the function of ideology as being something essential in any ponerogenic group, especially in the macrosocial phenomenon which is their homeland. This factor of awareness simultaneously constitutes a certain qualitative difference between the two above-mentioned relationships. Pathocrats know that their real ideology is derived from their deviant natures, and treat the other, the masking ideology, with barely concealed contempt. And the common people eventually begin to perceive this as noted. Thus, a well-developed pathocratic system no longer has a clear and direct relationship to its original ideology, which it only keeps as its primary traditional tool for action and masking. For practical purposes of pathocratic expansion, other ideologies may be useful, even if they contradict the main one and heap moral denunciation upon it. However, these other ideologies must be used with care, refraining from official acknowledgement within environments wherein the original ideology can be made to appear too foreign, discredited, and useless. So basically, this probably applies to most intelligence agencies, not just pathocracies. That you can use any ideology. Well, it does apply. Like, you just look at the history of the CIA, history of various unnamed intelligence agencies. They will use groups in foreign countries, in their own countries sometimes, as that are totally like antithetical to their own official ideology for political purposes. And so it's no different, and that says something about intelligence agencies and their possible like psychopathological nature. But with that said, Corey, did you have anything to say on that?
Don't be delusional.
Don't be delusional. Okay. Well, in that sense, I think we're gonna cut it short a bit today. And come back next week with some more stuff. So, if you haven't read the book yet, I'd recommend it, Political Ponerology. The reason we're doing these shows, not just because we find them fun, is because the book itself is kind of hard to read. So we're trying to go through it bit by bit to try to just make it a bit more comprehensible, because it is important. So if you read it and you don't really understand what's going on in the book, hopefully these talks can help. We got a playlist on our channel. If you just go to playlists, we've got a Ponerology one. We'll be putting up all our previous shows that we've done, even like before we were doing Mind Matters. We'll put up the old Truth Perspective episodes eventually. Some of our other discussions on other chapters, and eventually we'll get through the whole book, which should be fun. So thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.